glory. And so as a community, we want to work as a force for good. So now let me get into the book launch. We are very happy and privileged to launch this new book titled Kamala Harris and the Rise of Indian Americans. And this book is available on Amazon and other bookstores. It's available in the US on Amazon.com, in the UK, in India, as well as on Amazon.in. It's available, and it's the #1 new release in the Amazon bookstore in the Asian category in the US. So we're very happy with that. And we want to just launch into this program to talk a little bit more about the book itself, some housekeeping rules. If anyone has questions, please do put that in the chat box. And a bit later on, we'll also have you raise your hand in case we want to take some questions on the video program itself. So you can do either or. And to get started with the show, I want to introduce the person who is the author and the editor and the instigator of this whole program, who called me last September with an idea he had in mind. And so I want to welcome Tarun Basu. Tarun is an eminent journalist. He was one of the early people to launch actually a new service which served India very admirably, and he's an all-around good guy. So Tarun, welcome. I know you're in Delhi. So why on earth would an Indian actually want to do a book on Indian Americans?
Thank you, Amar. Thank you for having this launch and for this wonderful panel. And thank you for all your institutional support. At the outset, I want to thank you and my publisher for recognizing, as I said, the potential of this book and lending all its support. There have been books written on the diaspora earlier, as you all know, but to my mind, this is the first time such a book has been done from India and potentially for a global audience. You've already enumerated the reasons why people should write on Indian Americans. They are one of the most highest achieving community, and not just Indians are proud of it, but there are governments around the world who are taking notice of the community and its achievements, and how one member from the community has now become, it's become a cliche, a heartbeat away from the presidency of the United States. Now, why did I write this book? And why, as you said, rightly asked, why from India? Well, there is a little bit of a personal history to it, in the sense that I was a journalist in India when suddenly I got a call from New York, and that was in early 80s from Arun Lewis, who is now a UN correspondent, saying, look, George Bush, the senior George Bush was coming to India, and would you like to cover his visit? I said, cover for whom? And he said, there's this paper called India Abroad. And honestly, at that time, I had not heard about the paper. And he said, look, this is the voice of the community here. And this is a paper that's growing. This is a community which wants to be informed more about what is happening in India through the Indian perspective. And my editor, Gopal Raju, the iconic founder and visionary, the late editor and publisher of India Abroad, he got me on the line and he said, why don't you cover this? So I covered that, and then, I forgot about it. And then quickly fast forward, then came the assassination of Indira Gandhi in '84. And there was a huge shock around the world, and Gopal Raju was on the phone again that, why don't you write for us? And we are putting out a special edition of the paper. That was when the first contact started with India Abroad. And then I got to know more about this community and how this community was rising in eminence and climbing the success ladders in many fields. And that got me a little hooked. And to hook me a little more, Mr. Raju invited me and my family to New York on visit. And he said, look, you must know about the community, because you must remember there was no internet at that time. There was very little about the community coming into Indian media. And that is when I came to America. Then I heard about the early successes, the rise of people like Kumar Barve, Swati Dandekar, Sadhvi Chaudhary, to early, Minnesota, Maryland, Iowa houses. And I said, well, this is a story worth writing. And this is a story that not just India, the world must know about. And to cut a long story short, I set up this first office of India abroad in India in '87, and that is how the whole my connection and my interest and this whole story started. So when Kamala Harris was nominated as the running mate by Joe Biden, who himself had a long association with Indian Americans and India itself, it was that epiphanous moment. I had this whole lot of material. I had worked so much. I had made so many visits to the US with 3 prime ministers. I had made 3 visits to the White House. I had met up with so many Indian Americans. I said, why don't I write about it? And that is when I approached Shobit Arya, and he said, well, we see a story. But the question was, of course, from the business point of view, what if Kamala Harris loses? Then who's going to buy the book? Well, I said, that's a risk that you have to take. He said, will you get the authors? I said, let me try. So I was given 5 months to do this, and 5 months is too short a time to do this. But as you all know, things work. I wrote that email to MR. MR I had met only once at a dinner in Delhi. We were at the same table where Shashi Tharoor, one of the esteemed authors of this book, was also there. And MR immediately responded. And that's what I think, in a way, I mean, he's here. That's what makes him so great. He bought into this idea and he said, why? Yes, we will do it. That encouraged me a lot. And we were able to get together this amazing galaxy of authors in no time. So we have actually 19 contributors for this book, because some of the chapters, as you know, have 2 authors. 19 contributors. It was originally conceived as 200 pages. It's 308 pages, 16 chapters plus an epilogue. So here is this book, and we managed to do this, come out in less than a year. And that is, I thought, was a huge collective achievement. So, I would take this opportunity to thank my authors once again to accepting this invitation to be part of this unique project and to be able to meet the short deadline, and my continuous questions and persistence. And we have got this together, and I think the Wisdom Tree has done a great job of it. So thank you, MR, once again for putting this whole panel and this launch. Thank you.
Sorry, like I said, thank you so much for pushing us and getting this done, and love to be part of the project. As you know, you asked me to author the book or the chapter on Silicon Valley, and I jokingly tell people I've done a kiss and tell chapter, so everybody's got to read it to see whose name is in it. But it's great to be working with you. You've been terrific, and so has publisher Shobit Arya with Wisdom Tree as well. So thank you for the opening comments. I want to pull in our other 2 panelists for the first segment. We have 2 panels. One is the segment with you and 2 other eminent authors, and then the second panel will be conducted by our executive director Sanjeev Joshipura with 3 other panelists. So I want to pull in now Raj Gupta. Raj is a founder circle member of Indiaspora, a longtime supporter and friend, but in his own right, he's been CEO of a Fortune 500 company, Roman Haas, which he then subsequently merged with Dow Chemical. And then now he serves as chairman of Affluent on boards of many companies like DuPont and Avantor and others. Raj has been a leader in the business community. So when Tarun and I talked of who could best write a chapter on Indians, as you know, Indiaspora did a list of business leaders, and there were 60 people of Indian origin who were Fortune 500 and Forbes 2000 CEOs of public companies and such. So we said there's nobody better to chronicle the life and trials and tribulations of business leaders in the US. And so Raj, welcome to you to the program. And the first question I want to ask is, how was your life? You were one of the early CEOs of a Fortune 500 company. How was your life as a CEO? And second, in your chapter, you mentioned there were 6 characteristics of values that stood out for you as an Indian American. So maybe you can just talk about that for us.
Well, MR, And Tarun, thank you very much for the opportunity to write that chapter. It was kind of reminiscing my own journey over the years. I certainly migrated to the United States in early 1968, one of the very early batches. And I would say, a couple of things. First, to be in business as a businessman, a business leader, took good 3 decades, because migration of Indians started in mid-60s. And the first Indian CEO really was appointed in 94, Rajat Gupta, head of McKinsey, which is not a public company, but was a major consulting company. So it took us 30 years. And up until then, so if I think about my own journey, that was in 1998 when I was announced as chairman CEO of Roman Haas. It was a long process, and I would say Indian Americans were curious objects. And I had an opportunity to live in Europe for 15 years, 5 years in Paris and 10 years in London working for the company. And wherever I went, it was like there was strange look. Why are you here? And what got you here? And those are very early days. But I would say one thing, I think there is some unique things about us as Indians. And part of it, I would say, obviously, education has a lot to do, and the family values. And the merging of technology and business is something which is very intuitive to us. We have seen that, as MR mentioned, in the Silicon Valley as entrepreneurs. And I think over time, the corporations started to recognize that they bring a unique perspective. And I would say, 2 or 3 abilities of Indian Americans which really have served us well as a community in larger businesses. One is our ability to connect the dots. That means because we have such diverse experiences, culturally and otherwise, socially, that our ability to see the world, look at it from what's going on broadly, and be able to connect the dot is one very important aspect. And I would say that's a big event in business. The second one is, we were bold to leave India at age 20, 21 and come to graduate school and study. So our ability to take risk and being bold. I would say those are traits which are unique, in addition to, obviously, I talked about adaptability. Adaptability in business world and ability to pivot and change is so very important. And I think our background, training, and experience kind of has taught us to be intuitive about this. And I'd say the other thing I would say is just temperamentally. I think temperamentally, we are not volatile on average, I would say. We are not arrogant as people. And I think long-term, it serves in the business community very well. Having that even-tempered approach, ability to listen and adapt. And then on top of it, ability to lead people. If I were to point out one thing, which was the hardest part of my journey, was recognizing that it's not you what you do and how smart you are or how hard you work. It's more about, are you putting the organization ahead of yourself? And the second one, can people look up to you? Can you lead people? And I think those are the 2 most important traits as a leader, is obviously they see how smart you are, how organized you are, what great things you can do, how you think. But if they don't follow you, you go nowhere. And I would say those are few of my observations, MR, having lived in corporate world 39 years with the same company. And then in the last 25 years, having served in 15 public companies and 8 private companies, both executive chairman, non-executive chair of the comp committee, governance committee, across a wide range of industries, Hewlett Packard to Tyco, to DuPont, to many, many other companies. I think that's really what I found is our ability to just work across has been a very big positive for us as a community.
Thank you, Raj. Thank you so much for agreeing to write the chapter. And it's come out beautifully. And I encourage listeners to get the book and to delve into Raj's chapter of how he took the job, how he got the job, and about all the other CEOs, many of them on the Indiaspora business leaders list. which is on our website, by the way, which if you go there, you'll see the list. So thank you, Raj. I now want to bring Meena Chawla. Meena is a dear friend and a scholar and a diaspora expert. And she has had the opportunity to live in the US and in India. And so, I really want to thank her for her contribution, but also, can you talk a little bit, Meena, about your chapter, why you did the chapter? What were some of the lessons and gleanings from your research in this area?
Amar, thank you. It's great to meet friends and connect with so many people that I have known over the years. In this audience, there are former students of mine who I taught at American University in Georgetown, and there are many friends from the Indian American community. So I'm saying hi. And if these were normal times, I would never have been there. So I have to say this is the joy of the pandemic, which is a horrible thing to say, but so it is. So Amar, thank you. Sanjeev, thank you. Above all, Tarun, Shobit, it's been a great journey. How did my own journey start? So the story really dovetails what Amar and Raj have just talked about, with his success in business and so on. By the time I reached Washington, D.C. to live there, which was about 2008, 2009, I had already studied Indian diasporas and lived among them in multiple other countries. I had already written about Indian Jews in Israel, for example, who were a well-integrated community, but were not very successful. So I had certain models in my head about how diaspora communities actually dig their heels in and develop power through economic success and so on and so forth. So when I came in to deeply engage with Washington, D.C., that's when Obama had just fired the imagination of a lot of colored people in general. I remember a young man saying to me, when I grew up in school in Texas, there was no photograph among the presidents of the US who could look like me. So I saw around that time a huge spate of appointments of Indian Americans to key positions. And these were young people who came into the limelight: Raj Shah, Preeta Bansal, Neil Katyal, Vivek Murthy, Raj Kundra, and so many others. Around then came the 2010 midterm elections. And for the first time, 5 people were contesting elections. The results were not fantastic, but then 2012, Ami Bera came on. So I got very interested in this political trajectory. We all knew about Dilip Sond, and we knew about other things that had gone on, but there's something that seemed to be happening around this time. My vantage point was actually dual. Socially, because I was also there because I was the wife of a senior Indian diplomat. I had the opportunity and the privilege of being able to meet a lot of the community leaders, to attend more than 200 events. At the same time, I was faculty at these universities in Washington, D.C. My students were Indian Americans. From them, I began to get another perspective, the millennial perspective. From the many people that I met in Washington, D.C., who were serving at the time, appointees in the White House, I was able to see a different story emerging. I knew about the 100,000 physicians, the 40% hotel rooms owned by Indians. I knew about the spelling bee, and I also saw India-US relations thriving. But I was actually, as a scholar, much less interested in the diaspora-homeland relations. I was much more interested in the diaspora emerging as an interest group, because I was looking, while I was teaching courses on global Indians, I was looking at how this power was going to emerge, because the power of a diaspora has to be there in the homeland, in the adopted homeland. And I began to have conversations across generations. So I have to mention people like Shekhar Narasimhan, Mahinder Tak, Kumar Barve, Aruna Miller, Anurag Verma, Sonal Shah. There were just so many people who helped me to see how this story was evolving. Around that time, Indiaspora was born. Around that time was the first Indian American ball. So all of this began to be the field work. And I call this the decade 2010 to 2020 as the dynamic decade. I think that's what gradually led to the establishment of the Samosa Caucus and of Kamala Harris coming on. So I see certain shifts. I'm going to stop here now, and if there is time, I will speak about some specific shifts, which is what I see happening in the diaspora, its own identity and its engagement. So I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Meena. That was a wonderful kind of a tour of the political establishment as well as emerging as an interest group. So thank you, and I'm sure we'll have questions. By the way, there's Rachnath Hans. I think Ritanch Hans says, I still remember you as a professor at American University.
Oh.
So I think you have a lot of fans in the US as well. So let me wrap up this segment by talking a little bit, if I might, since I'm the moderator, I can talk as well about my chapter. And when Tarun asked me to write the chapter on Silicon Valley, I first looked at myself to see if I was even qualified to do that. Then, I've been here since 1982. So then I started thinking, my God, that's 4 decades of being in Silicon Valley. I came here, when Steve Jobs was running a tiny little company called Apple. Larry Ellison was running $1 million company called Oracle, and they all wanted to change the world. And nobody knew if they were going to change the world or these guys were, Barnum and Bailey, right? And that was the time when I came in. At that time, when I arrived, most of the Indians were engineers, and they worked at chip companies like Fairchild Semiconductor, National Semiconductor, and so forth. That was the first wave of Indians coming to Silicon Valley, if I was to look at the decade of the 80s. Then subsequent to that, a lot more went into the software field as computer technology itself changed from mainframes and COBOL language to mini computers and more accessible languages. A lot more Indians came into the software field and became entrepreneurs and entered the workforce in Silicon Valley. And through that, an organization like TIE was born, where they said, okay, we're going to promote Indian Americans as entrepreneurs and technologists and so forth, right? So that was kind of the second wave, if you will, was people, the computer architecture itself shifting from this monolithic mainframe computing to mini computers, desktop computers, client server computing. These are all the buzzwords of Silicon Valley, which then got a whole bunch of Indian Americans to be in the software field, become entrepreneurs, become successful, do IPOs and such. That was the second wave. Then the third wave was for Indian Americans to break into the venture capital space. This was an important moment because he who has money and gives out money can control and influence a lot more. And so that wave arrived, and now we have venture capitalists pretty much across Silicon Valley. Many of them are in the so-called list called the Forbes Midas list. If you look at that list, you'll see so many Indian Americans investors in the top 50 or top 100 investors in Silicon Valley or in the world. So that was the next wave of things that happened. And then subsequent to that, lo and behold, if you move another decade, we had people now running large technology companies, including the most valued company in the world, Microsoft. Satya Nadella heads up Microsoft. He's not an entrepreneur. He's a professional manager who came up the ranks and was appointed as CEO. Same thing with Sundar Pichai at Google, one of the other highly valued companies. Same with Shantanu Narayan at Adobe, and on and on and on. So there was this whole recognition that Indian Americans were not just entrepreneurs and technologists, but great professional managers and leaders. Like Raj Gupta was in the manufacturing space. Now suddenly the technology field saw a host of Indian Americans getting there. Now fast forward, the next wave that's upon us today, we need to study more, is a wave of Indian companies and Indian entrepreneurs who started their journey in India and have now moved in big droves to the United States because they sell to Fortune 500 companies, and they believe that their company should be headquartered in Silicon Valley to allow them to not only get talent, but be close to their customers. So their drove of unicorns now based in Silicon Valley, like Freshworks, Innovator, Unifor, Postman, all these are new era of companies where the founders started the company in India, moved the company to the US, got additional capital. And so the wave continues. And so that's the good side of things. Now, what are the challenges with the tech community? Much like many other communities, the challenge is clearly gender. We have very, very few Indian Americans in the tech workforce. And second, even starting companies. So I think that's an area we need to really work on, is how do we get more of our women to become technologists, to get into the computer science programs, and subsequently also to become CEOs, give them the opportunity to be CXOs and then CEOs of tech companies. So I'll leave it with that. There are lots to cover in the 3 chapters. You've heard from Maina about her chapter on politics and the diaspora. Raj's chapter is on business, and mine is on Silicon Valley. So I will wrap up my segment. My time is up and our time is up, but we will all be here to come back for the Q&A session. But I'm now going to turn this over to our eminent Executive Director, Sanjeev Joshipura. So Sanjeev, the floor is yours.
Thank you, MR, Raj, Maina, Tarun. Good evening, everyone, or good morning for you intrepid souls from India. I hardly feel eminent in the presence of such elite company, but thank you, MR. I'll take the introduction. So my name is Sanjeev Joshipura, and I'm the Executive Director of Indiaspora, coming to you from Washington, D.C. Just a couple of quick housekeeping notes before I start my panel. We will have a Q&A session at the end of my panel for both panels, that is MR's panel and my panelists as well. And when we start the Q&A session, you can either ask your question via the Q&A box, which is in Zoom. You'll see the menu at the bottom and you can type your question there, or you can raise your hand in Zoom, not on video, but use the Zoom raise your hand feature. And then when we call on you, we'll unmute you and you can turn on your video and ask the question. So let me launch directly into my panel. I have 3 panelists as well. And the first panelist I'd like to invite is Deepak Raj. Deepak Raj is a prominent Indiaspora member. He is the chairman of Pratham USA and is also the chairman of the India Philanthropy Alliance. He founded the Neera and Deepak Raj Center on Indian Economic Policy at Columbia University and is the co-founder in the political space of the Indian American Impact Group. Deepak and my colleague at Indiaspora, Ashish Shah, co-wrote the chapter on philanthropy in this book. And the chapter is titled Leading Meaningful Change, Building a Culture of Philanthropy Among Indian Americans. So Deepak, what I'm going to request you, welcome to the show, by the way. Delighted to have you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, you're joining us from New Jersey, is that correct?
Well, it has been an interesting day, so I'm actually back in New York to do this panel.
Okay, well, great. Thank you for joining us from the Big Apple. If you would, Deepak, please give us a quick 60-second summary of your chapter, and then I'll launch into a question that I have for you.
Oh, okay, sure. So thank you very much, Sanjeev. Thank you, MR, for this opportunity. Am I unmuted? Am I okay? Yeah. And it's a real pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be on this highly distinguished panel. And it is great to be in this company. And I want to, by the way, thank Ashish Shah, for a great job that he did working with me, on this chapter. The whole idea here was that there is this impression out there that the Indian community is not as charitable as can be. On the average, I think we spend less on philanthropy than the average American does. I think that numbers are sort of 1.5%, versus 4 or 5% on the average. And what we wanted to explore is that where are we on these trends? What does the future look like, for our diaspora, so far as the philanthropy outlook is concerned. And I think the signs are very, very encouraging, the signs that we saw. The whole diaspora, the philanthropy giving is changing rapidly. Obviously, just like any other community, it is dominated by the top of the pyramid. It's a well-known statistic that 20% of the donors, give 80%, of the dollars, in these charities, and in our community is probably even more so. However, the trends that we see is there's this incredible ecosystem that is developing. And this ecosystem that is developing is these smart young men and women, getting into philanthropy. We have advisors now, we have foundations, we have investors, who are in this space, and they are really changing the world. They are really changing the infrastructure, what we do in the community so far as philanthropy is concerned. And a couple of recent examples, or at least one example I would cite, is this amazing response we saw, and how quickly many of us were able to marshal resources for the COVID relief programs. I would mention AIF, extremely successful in raising funds. You mentioned Pratham, very successful in raising funds. And so this overall, I think that this whole pace of philanthropy has accelerated substantially. Second thing I would note very quickly, Sanjeev, is that we have now collaborative organizations working together to see how we can be more impactful. You mentioned IPA, the Indian Philanthropic Alliance. I'm privileged to be the chair of IPA, as Sanjeev said. And here the whole idea is that how can these 10 or 15 organizations who are members of IPA, how can we collaborate? How can we do things better and share best practices? While we have done well, on an individual basis, we still have a lot of room to grow on the foundation space and corporate space. So there are a lot of sleeves, that we can explore. Very quickly, I will mention, the Cello Give platform that Indiaspora started. There are some other platforms which have started as well, for retail giving. And I think that those things are just starting out with a long runway ahead. Last thing I will mention is that many Indian Americans, many people from our community are now in leadership roles, leadership positions in very, very important organizations. I'm talking about Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, and so on and so forth. So now we have mentors. We have people who can guide this whole effort, which we didn't have before. So overall, I think Indiaspora, has laid out a mission of doubling this 1.5%, over the next 2 years that we give as a percent of income, to philanthropic causes. The ecosystem is in place. It will obviously get better. But Indians are getting much more well settled in what we do. So we have a very optimistic outlook that we have laid out in the chapter. So thanks for this opportunity. And I look forward to any discussions, any questions, Sanjeev. I think I may have overstepped my 1 minute, by the way.
No,
Okay.
Deepak, I was just going to say that among your many gifts, Deepak, since I've known you, is the remarkable gift of prescience. And what you've done is now I don't even need to ask you the question that I was going to, which is about the upward trend and evolution of Indian diaspora philanthropy, which is exactly what you covered. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for writing the chapter, and along with Ashish Shah, and please do stick around for questions that I'm sure will come up towards the end of the show. I'd like to now invite, absolutely, I'd like to invite our second panelist, Shamita Dasgupta. Shamita Dasgupta is a co-founder of Manvi, an organization in the US that focuses on violence against women in the South Asian community. She has taught at Rutgers and in the clinical law program at NYU's law school. Shamita co-wrote a chapter along with Sujata Warrior called Success Through the Lens of Women, celebrating an alternative model of the marginalized. So this is an extremely interesting chapter, Shamita. Would you mind taking 60 seconds just to talk about it before we have a specific question? You're muted.
Okay, I couldn't unmute. The host was not allowing me. Thank you so much. And I'm sorry for the delay. Yes, it's very interesting for me to be here since I don't consider myself successful in the way that is being described here. But let me just focus on on what we have written, and perhaps more questions are going to come out of that. And what we have heard up to now is the building of an extremely successful community, successful in the sense of financially, politically, educationally, and position-wise in big companies. And so that's, of course, something to be very proud of. But in our chapter, my colleague Sujata Warrior and I moved away from this mainstream trajectory of success in our community, which is basically in economic and individual success. We need to recognize that this mainstream model, and I think Mr. Rangaswamy also kind of mentioned it in passing, that the mainstream model of success has noticeably excluded marginalized communities, communities such as women, LGBTQI, working class, the educationally nonconformists who don't fall into the doctor, engineer category, and the poor. And also the activists and change makers who have worked with these communities. So in this chapter, we interrogate our community's image of success, community success as itself, and as it is sometimes portrayed as a model minority. And we use the trope of battered women and sexually assaulted women's organization to discuss success. And we look at success through the lens of the marginalized. Now, we have traced I myself, when we were writing it, found it very interesting. We traced the path of anti-domestic violence organizations in our community and the path they established, and also the space they created for other progressive organizations, which I won't get into it. And, perhaps readers can read it and see. In one voice, I must say that in one voice, all of these organizations have challenged the recreation of culture, which does not necessarily only import valued and beneficial traditions, but they have also seemed to be importing misogyny, heteropatriarchy, classism, as well as homophobia. Now, we highlight the achievements of marginalized communities and the activists, and the significant changes they've brought in the community as well as the nation. Now, in addition, I think in the essay, there's a challenge to our community to do better by the overlooked and the marginalized members. After all, I'll remind our community again and again what Mahatma Gandhi said: the true measure of any society can be found in how it treats the most vulnerable members. And I hope that we can have a discussion on it later, or if you have questions. But our chapter basically moves out of the mainstream success model.
Shamita, so glad that you and Sujata wrote this chapter on, shining a light on the activists who are working to empower marginalized communities and so forth. It's such an important element that rarely gets discussed. And I'm very glad that you wrote this chapter as part of the book about the Indian diaspora. I'm sure we'll be coming back to you with questions. Last but not least, my final panelist is Bijal Patel. Bijal is an Indiaspora supporter and a chairman of the California Hotel and Lodging Association, the largest state hospitality group in America. He's also the CEO of the Coast Redwood Hospitality Group. And he is, by the way, the youngest person to head CHLA in the association's 128-year history. Bijal wrote the chapter on 3 generations of hoteliers, how Indian Americans reinvented the hotel industry. So Bijal, welcome to the program. And you're joining us from California. Let me ask you a question that dovetails nicely with not only what you've written, but also something that is a pillar and a plank for Indiaspora, which is about the spirit of giving back. In your chapter, you discuss the importance of seva, which is basically the spirit of giving back. And what do you see as the intersection between the hospitality industry and seva, especially in light of COVID-19 and the devastation that it has wrought on your sector?
Yeah, I think one of the earlier panelists mentioned about looking for or a positive that came out of the pandemic, and I think the idea or spirit of seva really kind of really showed a light in the hospitality industry throughout the pandemic. Our hospitality members here in the state of California quickly stepped up at the beginning of the pandemic. Not sure if you all remember, there was a cruise ship going up and down the state on the coastline of cruise ship passengers, and the state government didn't know what to do with them. The hospitals didn't know what to do with them. And a group of our members, hoteliers, stood up and said, you know what, we'll take them. We were shut otherwise, and we quickly enacted ways to get those passengers to our hotels and hosted them. And throughout the entire pandemic, we saw this kind of manifest in different ways. So hospitality stepped up and hosted thousands of guests that were COVID at risk, homeless populations, COVID recovering, those that needed to quarantine or isolate. Many thousand room nights were offered to first responders and essential workers, traveling nurses, those kinds of things. So we really kind of transitioned our facilities almost overnight into de facto kind of medical hubs, where we went back to the basics of our industry, which was to provide shelter and support to our communities in the times of most need. In our own city of San Francisco here in California, 8,000 hotel rooms were converted to provide assistance to those who needed shelter the most during the pandemic. So I think kind of the pandemic allowed us to really showcase that spirit of hospitality and seva quite well.
Fantastic. That's wonderful, Bijal. And your chapter tells such a moving story, but such an inspirational story as well. And I really encourage readers to get a hold of this book and read all these wonderful chapters by these great authors that we have had on the show today, as well as others in many different fields, all leaders in their own respective professions. Now we are turning it over to the Q&A session of this program. Again, what I'd like to ask you is, I invite you to either raise your hands in Zoom using the Zoom facility and hit the raise your hand button, or type your question in the Q&A box. And your question, when you ask it, please identify yourself and your affiliation. And if you would please direct it to a specific panelist. The questions are not just for the panel that I just hosted, but also for the earlier panel that M.R. Rangaswamy hosted. And maybe you have a question as well for M.R., who is one of the authors. So if we could invite questions at this time. I have a question from in the chat box from Sunita Sorabji. Sunita, we can unmute you, and if you want to come on video, you had a specific question for Bijal Patel.
Hi, yes, Bijal, California had both Project Home Key and Project Room Key, and Indian American hoteliers participated a great deal in both those programs. Could you talk a little bit about those programs to share with the audience at large?
Yeah, sure, definitely, most definitely. Thank you so much for the question. So as I was kind of mentioning that story of that phantom cruise ship going up and down the coast, that got the hoteliers' response to that and opening their hotel doors and providing that shelter really kind of caused Sacramento to look at the hospitality industry in a different way. And so in collaboration with the governor's office, Project Room Key was born. And for those of you that don't know, Project Room Key provided government funds to hotels that were, short, shut or closed, or due to low occupancy, federal dollars and state dollars to house homeless and at-risk community members. Then, the success of that program, as I said, almost 8,000 rooms in San Francisco, countless stories like that up and down the state. Project Home Key was born, and that was to basically take older hotels and transition their use into communities. So we've seen a lot of the Indian hoteliers sell a lot of the first assets that they had and transition those facilities into, again, community housing, shelter for domestic violence abuser survivors, homeless, et cetera, et cetera. So now that the pandemic has kind of, we've kind of seen the light at the end of the tunnel, Sacramento has then changed the program into Project Home Key, and that's to purchase the actual property. So a lot of our AHOA members, it's the Asian American Hotel Owners Association, have actually taken advantage of that program as we speak, and they are transitioning those assets into other uses, and then actually using those dollars to go ahead and build more hotels and to provide back to their communities. And that's very important because hotels, I'm not sure if everybody understands or realizes, but hotels actually provide almost $2.6 billion worth of general tax dollars to municipalities in the state of California. That's from 2018, that number. So we as an industry provide $2.6 billion worth of tax revenue to our local communities, which can then be used to fund police, firefighters, and other kind of city services.
Thank you, Sunita and Bijal. I now see Ritansh Hans has raised his hand. Ritansh, if you want to come on video, we'll unmute you and please ask your question and identify the specific panelists. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. This question is actually for Professor Singh, so I'm going to pretend I'm back in class with you. But have you found that candidates, running for office in the States that have shown their Indian heritage be negatively affected by it? The reason I ask this is because we have people like Bobby Jindal and Nikki Haley who make comments and say, there's no such thing as Indian Americans, we're all Americans. And as someone who's interested in running for office one day, it's rather discouraging to hear. I understand they're from the South and, environment may play a factor, but I'd love to get your opinion on this.
Thank you, Ritansh. It's great to see you. You're all young professionals now. You're no longer my students, but it's good to see you. So that's a great question. I think you took us back to about 15 years ago when the only poster children, so to say, were Nikki Haley and Bobby Jindal. I think the discourse has changed a lot. I did hear the stories around 2010 from Raj Goel in Kansas and Jay Goel in Ohio and other people, Manan Trivedi, who were all running for office from small towns or not so big towns in various states across America. Then again, the number of candidates who ran for office in 2020, I think that's a very heartening development already in terms of the acceptability of Indians to be running for office. Clearly, this is a generation that is born and raised in US schools. I think their sense of who they are is also very different. They articulate themselves differently. And I think their acceptability as running for office locally and otherwise has changed for the better. I do want to add one more thing, which is that I think the organizational models within the community have changed a lot. So there used to be RP, the physicians, the TIE, the PAN IIT, and all that. And I think I also want to tie it to the idea of how alternative narratives about what the community is, not just entrepreneurs and successful financial people, but also marginalized. I think all of that consciousness is now visible in the next generation. The millennials are very conscious of that. And so I see that, for example, Impact has now enabled a lot of people to seek funding when otherwise they had to be really wealthy at raising the money themselves. The other thing is, for example, SADA, which is an organization which is collating the histories of Indians South Asians, actually. And those histories are actually very mixed. They're also now giving a lot of importance to Dalit histories. So I think that also ties with another question I saw in the chat box from Anita Ratnam, which was saying something about the importance of integrating the complex and contrary narratives within the community itself. So that's a long answer to what you were saying. Thank you.
Thank you, Ritanj Maina. I see a question for Deepak Raj from Ken Silverman. Ken? So Ken has not been able to come on video for some reason, but Deepak, I'll just ask the question on his behalf. What efforts and impact can you describe relative to specifically motivating and activating philanthropic awareness and actions by second and third generation members of the Indian diaspora?
It's a very important point. Thanks for the question, Ken. In fact, within IPA, for example, we are having discussions constantly about how do you engage the next generation. I'm obviously the chair of Pratham board here in the US. There's an active effort that we have as a member of that body to actively find promising young men and women, younger men and women in our community to join the board and to get more actively engaged. The last 4 board members that we have elected, at the Pratham board, for example, are in their 30s or early 40s. So we are looking at gender diversity. We are looking at, different demographics. And so I think that, this is going to take a long time, obviously. As part of IPA, the Indian Philanthropic Alliance, we have started an essay competition to talk about Indian philanthropies, Indian NGOs. We had, last year was the first year, we had about 200 submissions. We had a panel of judges. We are doing it again this year. So this is something, that we have to be constantly focused on. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Deepak. Thank you, Ken. Smita Siddhanti, I see that you've raised your hand. If you could ask your question and identify the panelists, please.
Greetings, I'm from Washington, Smita Siddhanti. I wanted to add a comment, actually, more than a question to anybody. First of all, thank you. This is great panel. I'm on the global board of TIE, so TIE was mentioned many times, so I just wanted to acknowledge one thing, that from my vantage point, what I see this book has done, and this course is very, very useful to see how not only how Indian Americans are doing in India and how successful they are, it's what it does to our brothers and sisters in India as well. The first conference that happened at Pan IIT, I remember in 2006 here, and Sam Petrora's comment was, it's not what you guys are doing for yourself here successfully, it's how you encourage us in India to make ourselves feel better. So I did want to bring that perspective, that wonderful work that's being done with all organizations, and that with my, as I said, with my vantage point, with the 61 chapters across the globe. When I look at India's chapters, they are doing so extremely well, and especially the women entrepreneurs. To MR's point about getting women in tech, it's so heartening for me to see the amount of entrepreneurs that are coming out of India. And I think it's all part of what we are doing here, as when we were growing up, as we all said, we didn't have role models to see. So I did want to make that point, that this program, this book does wonders to add to that. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks so much for your comments, Smita, and thank you so much for your leadership as a woman on the Global TIE board. It's an inspiration for women and men all around the world. Parthiv Parekh has been waiting very patiently. I'd like to call on Parthiv now to ask his question. We have time just for 1 or 2 more questions, and then we'll wrap it up. Parthiv? No? Okay, maybe we'll come back to Parthiv, but let me go now to a question for Shamita. And I'd like to invite Pastor Carl McCluster from Connecticut, who is a good friend of Indiaspora. Pastor Carl, if you'd like to ask Shamita your question, please, on video.
Yes, thank you, Sanjeev. And this is a beautiful panel, so informative and so clear. You know, one of the things that I see that particularly the folks in the second panel talked about, I've seen about Indiaspora, and has touched my heart, is the spirit of philanthropy that exists and that is being cultivated. And it points out to me sometimes the dearth or the lack of that culture of philanthropy in other quote unquote minority organizations and peoples. And so I'm wondering if there are one or two thoughts about how to plant that seed, how to cause it to grow so that other cultural minorities, again, in the United States, might follow the lead that the Indian and community and the Indiaspora community has cultivated, even to the tying back to the homeland, to India, for fueling some of that, and then transporting that over. So it's a beautiful thing. And so I'm just wondering if you have a couple of thoughts or recommendations for other communities like the African American community.
Yeah, Sanjeev, if I could take that.
Please do.
Pastor Carl, thank you so much for that question. This is something that Indiaspora and the Indian community is maturing. I think Mana Chawla mentioned this and others have mentioned this, is the maturing of our community. For example, a year ago, as you remember, when BLM happened, Indiaspora came out strongly in support of what BLM was all about and the minorities and so forth. More recently, we wrote an op-ed when there was all these hate crimes against Asian Americans. So I think as a community, we are growing to see that we need to work with others, support others, and be together. And so I think it's a start of a journey for us, because like Shamita mentioned earlier, that this was a community that was originally called the model minority. You know, we came here, we got visas, we got jobs, we stayed out of trouble, didn't disturb anyone, to now where we're running for election, we're becoming philanthropists and activists. We are allowing and embracing other people who might be different than us. So I think it's a start of a journey. And I think we need to collaborate with your community. I know you are endeared to our community as well, since your wife is Indian, which is a beautiful thing to see here. But we need to do more of that with your community. And maybe we need to do a fundraiser in the US. And maybe this is something that Deepak Raj can take back to the Indiaspora Philanthropy Alliance, is to do something in collaboration with other communities of color on a program that might actually be in the US, not give back to India, but do something in the US for our own people. So that's just my thoughts. Deepak, anything you want to add? I think you're on mute.
No, that's an excellent point. And in fact, we need to do more work on that. As part of Impact, for example, which is something that I co-founded in the political arena. And man, we should talk, by the way. We are doing a lot of work there. So we are actively reaching out to the African American community, the Latin community, because we're trying to do the same things. Our objectives are the same. And when you look at the other communities here, Pastor, the objectives are the same, right? We want our kids to do better than we did. We want them to be well educated. We want them to get good jobs and so on and so forth. So I think, our value system are pretty much the same. But we will welcome the opportunity, and maybe we can have a sidebar conversation on this and see what are some of the things that we can do to follow up.
I would love the privilege of that. It's just, I have to say, the very first time when I logged on for the town hall, and then I stayed on afterwards and listened to the things that the members of the group were doing organically, not because someone was driving them to do it. It brought tears to my eyes 2 or 3 times during the course of that 45 minutes, just because people have cultivated this culture, this spirit of caring about those who are less fortunate. So.
Well, if I can just, I know we are out of time here, but what we obviously had our mayoral elections in New York, not that long ago. And one of the key things that a lot of people kept talking about is that students are in 5th grade or 6th grade, and they can read or write at the 1st or 2nd grade level. And so there's an incredible literacy issue here. And when I was listening to those kind of conversations, I said, oh boy, am I in India or am I in the US, right? I mean, that is what Pratham does, right? I mean, so, with the IP that's been developed. So I think there are many ways to think about here. In fact, last time our CEO was here, I introduced him to the Newark school system. And so there's things to do. So we ought to have more conversations.
Amen. Thank you so much.
Yeah, if I may add one word to that.
Yes, I was just going to come to you. The question was directed to you. So please do.
I just want to add to that is that for us as women, we have been connected to various organizations, Latina, African American, Hmong communities, Native American, just connected to them as women to women connections, and working on violence is something. Violence in the home is a very common phenomenon in all communities, and we've learned from each other and organized with each other, particularly the immigration acts of VAWA. We've always collaborated on those. So that kind of a connection is already there. It needs to be highlighted and celebrated and brought up.
Amen.
Thank you, Shamita. Thank you, Pastor Carl and Deepak and MR. We were going to go to Parthiv Parekh. So Parthiv, I know you're unmuted now. If you'd like to ask your question and direct it to a panelist, please.
Yes, thank you, Sanjeev. I appreciate it so much. Listen, as a publisher and editor of Cover Magazine based in Atlanta, we've been chronicling the community for more than close to 3 decades, actually. An event like this is me being a kid in a candy store. This is right up to the crux of what we do. So first of all, I wanted to appreciate Mr. Rangaswamy and Mr. Tarun Basu for this project and this opportunity to meet. I know time is short, so I'll go right into the question. But you guys are over here. The group we have here is the right folks to address this question to. My question is about this tag about model minority. So here's my thought process, and I'm sure Pastor McCluster and a lot of us would agree that there is a dynamic in the African American community which I'm very sad about, but I think that dynamic is where a young person or any person in the African American community is looking to do good, like getting himself a Ivy League education or getting successful. There is this tendency of others, bringing him down. Oh, you're turning white, In contrast, what we have in the Indian American community is we have a dynamic where people are pushed. Young person is pushed because there's success all around. Whether you call it financial success or educational success or overall there's success. Now, this is not to discount the fact that, as many of us have already talked here and we write about it all the time, that there are many of us who are, not as fortunate and we're struggling, and there are illegal Indian immigrants and all that. But my question maybe to Mr. Rangaswamy or to even Professor Singh would be that, is this tag of model minority a asset or a liability, or how should we handle it? Should we embrace it? Be critical about it?
Manna, you want to take it?
Okay, very quickly, and then I think you'd be a great person to respond. So I was actually going to say something related to the question about feminist and women's groups working across ethnic groups within America and other minority groups. And I think that's been the hallmark of women's organizations, that they have created lateral connections much more successfully than the political organizations have been able to do. But coming to what, I'm sorry, I couldn't read the name. Was it Mr. Parekh? But I think sorry. So what you said initially about the African American community, so I find it very difficult to create a parallel for comparison there, to say that, aspirations for success get to be tagged as you're trying to be white. I think just the kind of teenage years that a young South Asian or a young African American in the US has to go through influences are very different. I think that's a very long conversation, so I would be very careful about comparing. Coming to the model minority tag, I have to say, I think it's already outdated. And today's conversation has actually shown that it was a great tag and it was true, but it's no longer representative. That's all I want to say. That I think because we've acknowledged through this entire conversation that the community, the Indian American community, is not a monolith. I think that tag is now just a tag, not the tag. I also wanted to respond to some things that have come up more than once in the chat, which are saying, oh, Kamala Harris, is she Indian American? But she never says she's Indian American. What is Asian American? And that's a very common debate that's going on. I think the millennials, Indian Americans who are looking ahead to establish their own presence as a diaspora are already looking at the broader label. I've had many conversations with young people who said, I found it so hard to convince my father that we're actually part of Asian American Pacific Islander community, because the parents would say, I have nothing in common with them. And then it was like, oh, but we are very small in numbers. We need to broaden the tent. So I think there are a lot of things happening there which really question some of the tags and some of the jargon that has been used for self-definition of the community. I think it's all for the good, but I think these are important shifting trends. Over to you, MR.
Yeah, thank you, Mena. That was really good comments here. Again, what I want to add to that is there are two generations, and I think I want to get Shamita into this conversation when I finish, and that is the older generation. I would agree for, in a sense, for some of them, they were not getting into women's issues. Domestic violence wasn't being acknowledged. It was not my problem, and so forth. But I think I sense in my kids and the kids of many of us on this, at this event, they think very differently. My two daughters think completely differently than I do in terms of everything, including LGBTQ issues, violence. Their empathy factor is very different, emotional factor is very different. So I think we're comparing the older generation and the younger one, and I'd love for Shamita to chime in on this one.
Thank you. Couple of things. One is I'm going to respond to Mr. Parikh for a second, because it really bothered me what he said about the African American community and the youth there. You really need to look at the historical perspective on this and historical trajectory of the community before we do something. And thank you, Ms. Singh, for pointing that out and saying it. One of the, it's a very difficult conversation to have at this time. The model minority, again, it's passé at this point. Most of the community knows. People who are working in the community know that that doesn't work anymore. That label is obsolete, to say the least. And it was never actually, it was only there. It could be used only by suppressing the voices of the marginalized, otherwise not. It was never a monolith, our community. So I would suggest that you read a little bit more in it. And I think in our chapter, we have discussed this quite a bit, that how that label has been used to actually put communities against each other, communities that are ethnically different or different from the mainstream, the dominant white community. It has been used to pit them against each other. And I think the next generation, and I think you're absolutely right, Amar, to say that the next generation has really caught on to that and brought that up saying that and rejected that clearly, that that is not what it is. So it's not a question of whether we should embrace that label. It's 40 years old, and even 40 years ago, it didn't fit us very well. So, I mean, I think there's not much I can do. I mean, there can be a lot said about it. The conversation can be very complicated and long, and I won't get into that at this time.
Lovely, lovely discussion. Thank you to all the panelists. I will take the moderator's prerogative and ask one last question to close. And I want to ask that question of Raj Gupta. Raj, I want to stay on this topic of shifting lenses through which we view the genders, and hopefully more progressive lenses over time, and the generational differences that Shamita and MR and others have referred to. You have two daughters, Raj, Vanita and Amita, who are wonderfully successful in their own right in what they do. Tell us a little bit, if you would, do you see that kind of advancement of women among the Indian American community translating in the corporate space? Do you see a lot of Indian American women advancing up the ladder in the corporate world? And what is it that needs to be done more to further accentuate that advancement? Raj Gupta?
It doesn't.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Mansi. So sorry Raj isn't here anymore. It would have been a fascinating discussion with him, because I know that Raj feels very, very passionately about these topics. He's spoken about them before. But we are already about 17 minutes over time. The time has flown. It's been an outstanding discussion, a great event with lovely panelists. What a thought-provoking discussion. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Maina Singh Chawla, Bijal Patel, Tarun Basu, the editor, MR Rangaswamy, Indiaspora founder, Deepak Raj, Raj Gupta, and Shamita Das Gupta. I'd also like to thank my team, and in particular, Mansi Patel, our Director of Events and Communications, who organized this event. And thank you all for attending. On the chat, you'll see links where you can purchase this book, Kamala Harris and the Rise of the Indian Americans. And I'd encourage you to go buy it. It's a wonderful read. Thank you all for attending, and delighted that Indiaspora is a part of this very exciting book launch. Have a good evening or a good night, or if you're in India, enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, MR, Sanjeev, Tarun. Lovely. Thanks.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, MR. Thank you, Sanjeev. Thank you, Mansi, for putting this together. It's wonderful meeting all these people and to hear all their perspectives. I wish we could have a longer discussion. And while we're still here, I just want to make a point. This book was really not all about the glorification of a community or shining light only on the achievements alone. And I'm happy that Shamita and Sujata came into this. We had quite a bit of correspondence on this alone. And the alternate view that she offered, the kind of rejection of the view or the perspective of the model minority, and bringing in the alternative model of success, and talking about the marginalized and the non-conformist groups, that added a completely different dimension to this whole anthology. So I'm so happy to hear this discussion, and to, as Mansi said, take it into a larger broad tent where we've also got the African American perspective on that. So this is a subject for an entirely new and different discussion where I could have at a much later stage. So thank you all very much, and it was great to meet all of you virtually. And we hope we'll do this again. Thank you. Thank you, Indiaspora.
Thank you, Tarun.
Thank you, Tarun.
So much.
I want to say thank you to a very vibrant chat. I've been reading the chat, and it's been fascinating. So all the attendees, thank you very much. Sanjeev, there's almost something ready there for another conversation.
Absolutely. We'll have to do it another time.
On this just for a minute, it's almost going to be 100 years from the time where Bhagat Singh Thind, who was a US Army veteran, was denied citizenship by the US Supreme Court on the basis of his color. And that was in 1923, and we are now in 2021. How things have changed over 100 years, and the whole mobilization of the community, how the groups that worked in the early years to give the group, the community more respect and recognition. That also deserves a panel at some point of time where you can bring in some of the old timers who can talk about this. And how 100 years of struggle and mobilization that that's which is the subject of my chapter, and how the views of different presidents, American presidents, changed over time vis-a-vis the community. We could do that. That's an idea. All right.
Great ideas.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.